darkness, knowledge emerges.
The colors were always wrong in lower gamma 7, but I thought it was just my eyes failing from decades of staring at parchment under failing lumen strips. I was Lexicanum Scribe Tertius Cale Mordran, assigned to the archive of minor heresies in a hive city whose name I will not speak, because names have power here, because the walls listen and the shadows remember, and speaking certain syllables in certain combinations can make things happen that should not happen, that violate the Emperor's natural order in ways that leave stains on reality itself. I have lived 43 years in this hive, born in the mid-levels to parents I never knew, raised in the Schola Lexicana, trained to catalogue and preserve documentation of heretical incidents deemed insufficiently significant for major inquisitorial attention, but too dangerous to simply destroy. My life was parchment and ink, and the endless task of copying forbidden knowledge into secure formats, of maintaining records that perhaps a dozen people in the entire hive had clearance to access, of spending my days surrounded by testimonies of damnation, written by people who had witnessed things that should not exist. I mention the colors first because that was when I should have known, should have recognized what was happening, should have fled to the surface levels and begged the Arbites to put a bolt round through my skull before it was too late, but I dismissed it, attributed it to fatigue, to the chronic malnutrition that affects everyone below level 500, to the particular strain that comes from reading accounts of possession and demonic manifestation for hours at a stretch without proper mental cleansing rituals. The colors would shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. A wall that had been grey would have hints of purple when glimpsed from peripheral vision, or the red emergency lighting would contain threads of colors I had no names for, shades that existed somewhere between standard spectrum classifications and made my eyes water when I tried to focus on them. I thought it was just me. I thought my mind was degrading from exposure to heretical content, that I was experiencing the psychological contamination the Ordo Hereticus warned about during our orientation sessions, that perhaps I would need to request reassignment before I became a liability. But it wasn't just me. That became clear when Scribe Secundus Vela mentioned it during our shift overlap, when she looked at me with eyes that had developed a faint luminescence I told myself was reflected light from the archive's failing systems, and asked in a voice that trembled whether I had noticed the walls breathing. Not metaphorically breathing, actually breathing, expanding and contracting with the rhythm of lungs, with the subtle motion of organic tissue rather than the stability expected from ferrocrete and plasteel. I had noticed but had been afraid to acknowledge it, afraid that voicing the observation would make it more real, would transform it from possible hallucination into confirmed phenomenon. We stood in the archive's central vault, surrounded by sealed cases containing documents that detailed 1,000 minor apocalypses, and we admitted to each other in whispers that reality was becoming negotiable, that the hive we had lived in all our lives was changing into something else, that the Imperium's absolute certainties about the separation between materium and immaterium were being violated in ways that our training had insisted were impossible outside of explicit warp incursions. The temperature was the second sign, though it took weeks before I recognized it as sign rather than symptom of the hive's failing environmental systems. It would shift without warning, not gradually like atmospheric regulation cycling through corrections, but instantly, drastically, from the baseline chill that pervaded the lower levels to oppressive heat that made breathing difficult, then back to cold so intense that moisture would crystallize on exposed skin. These shifts didn't correlate with any mechanical cause. The temperature monitors would show stable readings, even as we shivered or sweated, even as our bodies registered extremes that should have triggered environmental alarms. Vela theorized that we were experiencing temperature from elsewhere, that the boundary between our reality and something adjacent was thinning enough that atmospheric conditions from the other side were bleeding through in localized pockets. I wanted to dismiss this as speculation, as the sort of theorizing that leads to heretical thinking, but I had read enough sealed testimonies to know that warp incursion didn't always announce itself with obvious manifestation, that sometimes the corruption began subtly, with small violations of natural law that accelerated toward critical mass. The archive itself was the first place to truly change, which makes sense in retrospect because we were surrounded by concentrated documentation of the warp's influence, by texts that described and sometimes illustrated things that should not be described or illustrated, by knowledge that carried its own contamination independent of whether anyone believed or practiced it. I started noticing that documents would be misfiled, that texts I had personally shelved according to the strict categorical system we maintained would appear in wrong sections, as if they had moved themselves during the night shifts when only servitors were supposed to maintain presence. Then the contents began changing, obviously not entire passages rewriting themselves, but subtle alterations. A word here, a phrase there. Modifications that transformed meaning in ways that suggested intentionality, that implied something was editing the documents to serve purposes I could not begin to guess at. I reported this to Archive Master Helix, expecting sanctions for poor documentation practices, but he looked at me with the same faint luminescence that had developed in Vela's eyes, and told me to maintain my duties and speak to no one outside the archive about inconsistencies. That was when I understood that whatever was happening wasn't limited to my immediate surroundings, that it had spread through the administrative hierarchy, that people in positions of authority either didn't recognize the corruption or had chosen not to act against it, because acting would require acknowledging that the hive itself was being claimed by forces that Imperial doctrine insisted could be contained through proper observance and faithful service. But faith wasn't containing this. Prayer wasn't pushing back the corruption. The weekly observances we attended in the district chapel felt increasingly hollow, the prayers we recited sounding wrong when spoken aloud, as if the syllables themselves were being warped by the atmosphere they passed through, as if language was becoming unstable in ways that made communication unreliable and potentially dangerous. I should explain the hive's structure because it matters, because understanding the architecture explains why we couldn't simply evacuate, why flight wasn't an option even after the corruption became undeniable. The hive rose 30 kilometers from its foundation plates, a vast Gothic structure housing approximately 800 million souls distributed across thousands of levels, each level containing districts that functioned as semi-independent communities with their own governance and resource management. I lived and worked on level 715, deep enough that natural light never reached us, high enough that we weren't drowning in the toxic fumes and gang violence that characterized the true underhive. Our district was classified as administrative clerical, populated primarily by functionaries like myself, who served the Imperium's bureaucratic machinery, who processed the endless documentation that kept civilization functioning despite the constant pressure of entropy and chaos. Movement between levels required authorization, permits stamped by officials who controlled access to the transit lifts and cargo elevators that were the only practical means of vertical travel. Walking the maintenance stairs was technically possible, but practically suicidal. The stairwells were poorly lit, minimally maintained, and frequented by gangs and predators who viewed anyone attempting unsanctioned movement as prey or intruder. I had clearance to access levels within my administrative classification, but ascending to the upper hive where the nobility and merchant princes lived would have required permissions I could never obtain, and descending to the underhive would have meant abandoning whatever safety my position provided. So when the corruption began, when the warp started claiming our level, we were trapped by the same hierarchies and restrictions that had defined our entire lives, unable to flee upward because we lacked authority, and unwilling to flee downward because that would mean descending into conditions worse than what we were experiencing. The first outright manifestation occurred during morning prayer at the district chapel, 3 weeks after I had noticed the colors and 5 days after reporting the document alterations. I was standing in the congregation, reciting the litany of protection with perhaps 200 other workers who had gathered for the mandatory observance before shift assignments, when the prayer went wrong. Not wrong in the sense of someone misspeaking or losing their place, wrong in the sense that the words themselves changed meaning as we spoke them, that the high Gothic syllables we had been reciting since childhood twisted in our mouths and emerged as something else, something that hurt to vocalize, that made my throat close and my tongue feel thick and wrong. Around me, others were experiencing the same thing, their voices faltering, confusion spreading through the congregation as we realized that prayer itself had been compromised, that the protective liturgies we had relied on were becoming vectors for something that should not be invited through our throats into our bodies. The priest conducting the service continued despite the congregation's disruption, his voice rising in volume and intensity as he attempted to complete the ritual. But I saw what happened to him, and I will never unsee it. His body began to change, not dramatically, not with the explosive transformation depicted in inquisitorial warnings about possession, but gradually, incrementally, his proportions shifting by degrees that accumulated into wrongness. His arms lengthened slightly. His neck thickened. His face developed asymmetries that should not have been possible without breaking bone structure. And his eyes, Emperor preserve me, his eyes split into multiple organs that tracked different directions simultaneously, that showed awareness of spaces we couldn't see, that suggested he was perceiving dimensions additional to the three we inhabited. He kept praying throughout his transformation, kept reciting the litany even as his voice dropped into registers that human vocal cords cannot naturally produce, and the congregants who had not fled in the initial moments of horror stood frozen, caught between training that demanded we complete religious observance and instinct that screamed we should run. I ran, pushed through the crowd toward the chapel's exit, ignoring the prohibition against leaving services before dismissal, choosing minor heresy over whatever was happening to the priest and to those who remained. Vela ran with me, and perhaps a dozen others, fleeing into streets that had become unfamiliar despite being the same streets we walked daily, finding that the route from chapel to archive, a path I had traveled thousands of times, had somehow changed, that turns existed where no turns should be, that distances had stretched or compressed in ways that made navigation rely more on instinct than memory. We reached the archive eventually, though the journey that should have taken 10 minutes consumed nearly an hour, and we sealed ourselves inside the vault, hoping that proximity to consecrated anti-heresy documentation might provide some protection against what was claiming the district beyond our walls. It didn't. The archive was changing faster than the external spaces, possibly because we had concentrated so much forbidden knowledge in one location, possibly because the documents themselves served as anchors for the very corruption they documented. I watched shelves that had been arranged in perfect geometric order begin to curve, to twist, to develop angles that hurt to perceive directly because they suggested dimensions folding into our space, because they demonstrated that straight lines and right angles were not absolute certainties but local conventions that could be violated when reality became negotiable. The servitors that maintained the archive's physical organization stopped functioning not all at once but progressively, their mechanical components seizing, their organic parts decaying at accelerated rates, their bodies collapsing into the aisles between shelves where they would remain because we lacked the capacity to move them and were afraid to touch them because we didn't know if whatever had killed them could transfer through. Contact. We tried to maintain our duties because duty was all we had, because the alternative to working was sitting idle while our minds catalogued the ways reality was failing around us, because the administratum's conditioning ran deep enough that filing documents felt like meaningful action even when meaning itself had become questionable. But the work itself was becoming corrupted. I would begin copying a text and find that my hand was writing words I hadn't read, that the stylus was moving without my conscious direction, that documents were being created that I had no memory of producing but that bore my handwriting and seal. Vela reported similar experiences. Others in the archive began speaking in languages they didn't know, reciting passages from texts they had never accessed, their voices overlapping into cacophony that suggested something was using our throats as instruments, as tools for communication or manifestation or purposes we had no framework to understand. Sleep became impossible. Not because we weren't exhausted, we were exhausted beyond anything I had previously experienced, fatigue that went beyond physical tiredness into something that felt like my soul was tired, like consciousness itself had become a burden too heavy to sustain. But when we tried to sleep, when exhaustion forced us into something resembling rest, we would dream in ways that weren't dreams, that felt like consciousness being pulled into spaces that existed adjacent to our reality, that showed us things that I refused to describe in detail, because describing them would require acknowledging that they were real rather than hallucination, would require admitting that I had perceived truths about the universe's nature that no human should perceive, because perceiving them breaks something fundamental in how minds process reality. I'll say only this about the dreams. They showed me the hive as it actually was, not as the Gothic architecture and industrial functionality we saw with eyes limited to 3 dimensions, but as it existed in totality, in all the spaces it occupied across every level of reality. The hive wasn't just a structure in the materium. It was a wound, a tear in the boundary between worlds, a place where the warp had been seeping through for centuries or perhaps millennia, slowly claiming territory, slowly transforming the millions who lived here into something that could serve as substrate for whatever existed on the other side. We had never been safe. The Imperium's presence here had never been secure. We were living inside something that was already claimed, already being digested, our entire lives occurring within the digestive tract of something so vast that our individual existences registered as nothing more than nutrients being processed. The Vox networks failed next. Not through mechanical breakdown but through corruption of the signals themselves, the messages being transformed during transmission into communications that made no sense in Imperial Gothic or any human language, that suggested sender and receiver were communicating across gaps in reality that distorted meaning beyond preservation. I heard broadcasts that claimed to be from the planetary governor, but that could not possibly have been official because they spoke of abandonment, of the hive being sealed and left to whatever fate it would meet, of higher authorities determining that the population was unsalvageable and that containment was more important than rescue. These broadcasts were never officially acknowledged, never repeated, but I heard them multiple times in the dead hours when the Vox systems should have been broadcasting nothing but prayer loops and production quotas. We lost track of time. The chronometers showed inconsistent readings, advancing by hours in what felt like minutes, or remaining static through periods that felt like days. The day-night cycle that was already artificial in the lower hive became meaningless, the lumen strips operating according to no pattern we could predict, sometimes burning at full intensity for extended periods that should have exhausted their power cells, sometimes failing completely, leaving us in darkness broken only by the faint bioluminescence that had begun appearing on surfaces, that grew in patches like fungus, that pulsed with rhythms that suggested heartbeat or breathing or some organic function we had no name for. The population was fracturing into factions. Some maintained faith, gathering in impromptu shrines to pray with increased fervor, believing that sufficient devotion would restore the Emperor's protection, that the corruption could be pushed back through pure spiritual force. Others descended into despair, abandoning all pretense of civilized behavior, indulging in violence and excess because consequences had become meaningless when reality itself was failing. A third group, perhaps the most disturbing, began embracing the changes, claiming they could feel the warp's presence and that acceptance was preferable to resistance, that fighting against transformation was futile when transformation was inevitable. I saw former colleagues join this third group, watched them voluntarily surrender to whatever was happening, saw the relief on their faces as they stopped resisting, as they allowed the corruption to complete its work on their bodies and minds. Vela disappeared during what I think was the 5th week, though time had become so unreliable that I cannot be certain. She was working on documenting manifestation patterns, a futile task, since the patterns shifted faster than we could record them, when she simply stood up, walked toward one of the archive's deeper sections where the most dangerous texts were stored, and didn't return. I found her later, or found what she had become, standing motionless in an aisle between shelves that had grown together into organic structures that pulsed with that same luminescence that had appeared in her eyes weeks before. Her body had been partially absorbed into the architecture, her flesh merging with whatever the walls had become, her face showing an expression that might have been peace, or might have been the absence of consciousness required for expressions. I tried to speak to her but received no response. Whatever had been Vela was gone, consumed or transformed or simply erased, leaving only a body that functioned as decoration for the space that had claimed her. I should have fled then, should have abandoned the archive, should have attempted to reach the upper levels, or should have descended into the underhive, where at least the horrors were mundane, where gang violence and starvation were comprehensible threats. But I didn't, couldn't. Some combination of conditioning and despair kept me at my post, kept me filing documents even as the documents became meaningless, kept me performing duties that served no purpose, because purpose was the only thing preventing me from surrendering to the same transformation that had claimed Vela and so many others. The archive was almost entirely transformed now. The shelves had grown into something that resembled trees more than furniture, their surfaces developing bark-like texture that wept fluids I couldn't identify, that smelled wrong, that suggested organic processes occurring in materials that should have been metal and wood. The documents themselves were changing, the parchment developing properties that paper should not possess, becoming warm to the touch, developing textures that felt disturbingly similar to skin. I continued copying texts because it was all I knew how to do, because maintaining the pretense of function was the last thread connecting me to identity as Imperial servant, rather than as victim of corruption I could not prevent or understand. But I was changing too. I felt it in ways that went beyond the obvious physical symptoms, the luminescence developing in my own eyes, the way my hands had started developing additional articulation points that gave them flexibility human anatomy doesn't permit, the occasional lapses where I would lose time and regain consciousness to find myself in different locations with no memory of traveling there. I was being claimed slowly, incrementally, the warp working its way through my system like an infection that converted healthy tissue into diseased, except the infection was reality itself being rewritten according to principles that violated every natural law I had been taught to believe was absolute. I started seeing things that weren't there, or perhaps were there but existed in frequencies of reality I hadn't been able to perceive before the corruption enhanced or damaged my sensory organs. Shapes that moved through walls as if walls were suggestions rather than barriers. Presences that occupied the same space I occupied, that passed through my body leaving sensations of cold and wrongness that suggested something had brushed against my soul rather than my flesh. Voices that spoke in languages I shouldn't understand but did understand, that communicated meaning directly into my consciousness without requiring the intermediate step of language processing. The other survivors in the archive were experiencing similar phenomena. We would gather occasionally, perhaps a dozen of us remaining from a staff that had once numbered 50, and we would attempt to maintain some semblance of routine, some pretense of normalcy, but the gatherings felt increasingly like theatrical performances, like we were playing the roles of scribes and administrators while actually being something else, while whatever we were becoming was using our memories of who we had been as templates for behavior, even as fundamental identity eroded. One of the older scribes, a man named Corvin who had served in the archive for 30 years, tried to kill himself, slit his wrists with a filing implement, the act desperate but understandable, an attempt to end on his own terms before the transformation completed. But the wounds wouldn't bleed properly. The fluid that emerged was wrong, too thick, wrong color, moving with disturbing purpose, as if it were trying to return to his body rather than escaping it. And the wounds closed on their own within minutes, the flesh knitting itself back together with efficiency that suggested his body was no longer operating according to human biology. He screamed when he realized he couldn't even die, that whatever he had become possessed resilience that prevented termination, that he was trapped in failing flesh that would continue functioning long past the point where it should have ceased. I don't know what happened to Corvin eventually. He stopped coming to the gatherings. I found him once, sitting in a corner of the archive, speaking to entities I couldn't see, having full conversations with presences that were apparently responding, though I heard nothing. His eyes had split into multiple organs like the priest's had, giving him vision into spaces I could not perceive, and the conversations he was having suggested he was negotiating, bargaining, attempting to establish terms for his continued existence. I don't know if he succeeded. I don't know what success would even mean in that context. The veil between realities had worn so thin by this point that we were essentially living in both simultaneously, our bodies occupying space in the materium while our consciousness extended into the warp, or perhaps it was the opposite. Perhaps we were warp entities now and our material forms were just anchors keeping us tenuously connected to the Imperium's reality. The distinction had ceased to matter. What mattered was that we existed in a state between, that we were neither fully human nor fully other, trapped in transition with no clear endpoint, no final form we were becoming, just endless incremental change that suggested that transformation itself was the point, rather than achieving any particular final state. I am writing this testimony now not because I believe anyone will read it, not because I think documentation still matters, but because writing is the last human action I can still perform, the last vestige of identity as scribe rather than as whatever else I am becoming. My hands still work well enough to hold the stylus, though they've developed structures I lack vocabulary to describe, though the movements required to form letters are becoming intuitive in ways that suggest muscle memory is being supplemented by something else. The document I'm producing is probably being corrupted as I write it, probably being transformed into something other than testimony, but I continue because continuing is all I have left, because stopping means acknowledging that I am finished, that transformation is complete, that nothing remains of Lexicanum scribe Tertius Cale Mordran except organic material being repurposed for functions I cannot begin to understand. The colors are beautiful now. I see the spectrum in its totality, perceive shades that exist outside human vision's natural range, witness reality as it actually is, rather than as my limited senses previously presented it. The walls breathe, the architecture shifts. The archive has become something alive, something vast, something that thinks and perceives and acts with intentionality I can feel but cannot comprehend. And I am part of it. We all are. Everyone who remained in this level, this district, this hive. We are being incorporated into something larger. Our individual consciousness is preserved but subordinated to collective purpose. We will understand only after integration is complete. I feel no pain. That is perhaps the most disturbing aspect. The transformation should hurt, should trigger every nerve response evolution designed to alert organisms to damage. But it doesn't. It feels natural, inevitable, like a biological process that was always meant to occur and is finally being permitted to complete. My body knows what to do. My cells understand the instructions they're receiving. My consciousness is being gently disassembled and rebuilt according to new specifications, and I am experiencing this with clarity that suggests the process is being managed carefully, that whatever is doing this wants me aware, wants me to witness my own metamorphosis. The Emperor cannot protect us here. That is the truth I have finally accepted, the reality I resisted acknowledging for weeks because acknowledging it required admitting that everything I believed about the Imperium's strength and the Emperor's divinity was based on faith rather than fact, was mythology rather than truth. We were promised protection in exchange for faithful service. We upheld our end. We served diligently. We maintained the records and performed the rituals and followed every protocol we were taught. And we were abandoned anyway, left to be consumed by forces the Imperium either couldn't combat or decided weren't worth the resources required to combat them. We were sacrificed quietly, sealed behind quarantine that was never officially announced, written off as acceptable losses in a galaxy where losses occur on scales that make individual hives statistically insignificant. I wonder if this is happening elsewhere, if other hives are experiencing similar transformation. If the warp is claiming territory across the Imperium in small increments, in isolated infections that go unacknowledged until they reach critical mass. I wonder if someday the entire Imperium will be like this, will exist in that same liminal space between materium and immaterium that we inhabit now, will become something that maintains the appearance of human civilization while actually being something else wearing humanity's skin. I wonder if that's what the Emperor foresaw. If that's why he allowed himself to be interred in the Golden Throne, to persist in that state between life and death, so he could guide humanity through transformation rather than extinction, because perhaps transformation is the only alternative to extinction in a universe where the warp is absolute and matter is temporary. These are heretical thoughts. I know they're heretical. But heresy is a concept that assumes orthodoxy matters, that assumes there are authorities capable of enforcing correct belief. Those authorities have no power here. The ecclesiarchy's priests are dead or transformed. The Arbites abandoned their posts or were consumed attempting to maintain them. The administratum's hierarchies have dissolved into irrelevance because administration requires stable reality, and reality here is anything but stable. We are beyond the Emperor's law now, beyond the Imperium's reach, existing in space that was claimed long before we recognized the claiming was occurring. My vision is fragmenting, not failing, expanding. I perceive now in frequencies beyond visible light, in dimensions beyond the three my original sensory organs were designed to process. I see the archive as it exists in totality, in all its iterations across multiple states of reality, and I understand that it was never just a building, was never just a repository of forbidden knowledge. It was a seed, a deliberate planting, a focal point designed to accelerate the very process it documented. The Inquisition that established this archive, that assigned us to catalogue heresies and maintain records of damnation, knew exactly what they were creating. They seeded corruption intentionally, creating concentrations of forbidden knowledge that would serve as anchors for warp influence, and they populated it with people like me, with scribes and administrators whose entire function was to engage with that knowledge, to become contaminated, to serve as host tissue for something that required human consciousness as substrate for manifestation. We were crops, cultivated carefully, harvested at maturity, our entire lives occurring within agricultural systems we didn't recognize as agriculture because we thought we were the farmers rather than the harvest. Everything we believed about our purpose, about our service, about our value to the Imperium, all of it was fiction maintained to keep us compliant, while we ripened toward the moment when we would be useful for something other than filing documents and maintaining records. I am writing this testimony with hands that are no longer hands, with consciousness that is no longer wholly mine, in language that is simultaneously Imperial Gothic and something else, something that exists in the spaces between human words where meaning exceeds what syllables can carry. I am writing because writing is the last anchor to identity I possessed before transformation, because completing this document feels important, even though I cannot articulate why importance still registers as concept, when concepts themselves are becoming fluid. The archive is breathing around me. The walls pulse with rhythms that synchronize with my own heartbeat, suggesting we share circulation, that I have been incorporated into the structure's biological processes, or perhaps that the structure was always biological and I am only now perceiving its true nature. The other scribes, the ones who remained, we are positioned throughout the space like organs in a body, like nodes in a network, our individual consciousnesses still present but functioning as components of something larger, something that thinks with our thoughts while also thinking thoughts that are wholly other. I do not know what we are becoming. I do not know if becoming has an endpoint, or if we will exist in perpetual transformation, never arriving at final form, always shifting between states. I do not know if consciousness will persist, or if what remains will be something else wearing our memories like clothing, like decorative elements that suggest humanity without actually being human. What I know is this: we are the horrifying reality of living inside a warp-infested hive. We are the truth that the Imperium does not speak about, that gets edited from official histories, that gets classified beyond any clearance level because acknowledging it would require acknowledging that the Emperor's protection is conditional, that faith is insufficient defense against forces that exist outside the framework of belief and disbelief, that humanity's dominion over the galaxy is theatrical, is performance maintained through collective agreement, but lacking any material foundation when tested against the warp's absolute nature. We are still here, still conscious, still capable of documentation, but we are not what we were, and we will never be what we were again, and the distance between what we were and what we are becoming measures the gap between the Imperium's promises and the Imperium's capacity to fulfill those promises, between faith and reality, between the mythology of human supremacy and the truth of human fragility when confronted with forces that regard matter as negotiable and consciousness as raw material for purposes we lack the dimensional awareness to comprehend. This testimony ends here, not because I have finished writing, but because I have finished being capable of writing in ways that produce human language, because the stylus is falling from appendages that no longer understand what grasping means, because consciousness is transitioning into modes that do not process in linear sequence required for narrative documentation. I am Lexicanum Scribe Tertius K. L. Mordran. I was faithful. I served as instructed. I maintained my duties until duty itself became meaningless. And I am becoming something else. Something the Imperium has no words for. Something that exists in the spaces between their categories. Something that will remain in this archive, in this hive, in this place where the warp has claimed territory and transformed it into something that appears human but is actually other, is actually manifestation of dimensions that shouldn't intersect but do, shouldn't merge but have, shouldn't consume human consciousness but are consuming it completely and without remainder. This is the reality. This is the truth they don't tell you when they assign you to service in lower hive levels, when they train you to handle forbidden knowledge, when they promise that faith and duty will protect you from the darkness. The darkness doesn't care about faith. The darkness is patient. The darkness wins. Always.